Welcome to LeapFrogBI Academy course BD 120, Data Flow Diagram. This is the fifth video in this course where we will be talking about the fact table, our sales fact table, and we'll also be doing a quick wrap up for the entire course. So let's jump in. We're going to get started by taking a look once again at our data model. We have in place our four dimensions: dim, date, product, promotion, and location. We have our data flow diagram in place, that is. Now we need to create a data flow diagram for fact sales. Now the fact sales table will have a relationship, of course, to each of our four dimensions. And we've already established that there is also going to be a degenerate dimension here, which is going to be what we call a transaction ID at the time that we modeled this. But now what we need to do is take a closer look at the source system, where we're going to be collecting our sales details and figure out how we're going to actually collect that information and transpose it to the point that we actually have a fact table ready to go. So let's go over to our AdventureWorks database. All right, so we have two tables here that we're going to use for our source. First of all, the lowest level of data is available in our sales order detail table. And in this table, we can take a look quickly here and see that the primary key is on sales order ID and sales order detail ID combined. Now, the sales order ID is going to be what's going to relate us back to our sales order header. In fact, if we take a quick look at the header, we can see the primary key here of the header is a sales order ID. Going back to our detail, though, the other thing that's important to note here is that the sales order detail ID is an identity. We can quickly look at the design of this table, go to the sales order detail ID, and we can see that it is an identity with step 1.1. So we know that sales order detail ID is unique across all line items or details for our facts. And we also know that sales order ID is what's going to be used to get from our sales order detail back to the header. So let's, with that in place, and also we have our facts, of course, in our detail that we're most interested in, which is our price, our line total, quantity, so on. Now, our detail is how we're going to relate to our product dimension. That's going to be very simple. We're going to come straight off of our product ID. So that's going to be good. And then our special ID, offer ID, will get us to our promotion dimension. So that leaves us with our date and our location dimension, which we're going to need to get some information from our header in order to get that, get our relationship set to those two dimensions. So once again, we're going to join our header and detail on sales order ID. That's pretty easy. And to get to our location, which actually is a territory in our source system, we're going to use our territory ID. And then we'll have a few different dates here that are available: our order date, due date, ship date. Okay, so we have a pretty good understanding what our source system looks like. Let's jump over to our data flow diagram. We're going to add a page in here for fact sales and get started. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. All right. So let's start out by creating a data flow diagram for our fact grain, which is actually going to be sourced from sales order detail. So I'm going to drag in the design pattern here for a fact table. And I'm going to go ahead and set some of this up. All right, so first of all, once again, the first three components, we're going to just name these after the source table. Let's move this over here. Sales order detail. Okay. And let's name the rest of these while we're at it. Sales order detail. Sales order detail for our FA. And all of these components you should be very familiar with by now. Each of the data flow diagrams for our dimensions followed a very similar pattern. And finally, our updated load status, this time for a fact table, we'll name that the same. Okay. So starting out with our profile, we're going to take a look at that source system again to make sure we know how we're going to identify new records. So jump over there, look at our sales order detail table. You can see we do have a modified date. I've profiled it, and I know that modified date is being handled in the way that we would expect. So once again, it's going to be modified date for our incremental load criteria. This is just saying that we're going to collect anything that is newer than our most recently or our latest collected modified date. Okay, and then for our stage component, this is where we're simply going to copy the new records over to our destination, which is going to be the stage connection. In PSA, once again, we're going to set the record time to modified date. Modified date, we're going to collect a parameter. This way we'll know what the most or the maximum modified date that has been collected before to aid us in our incremental extraction. So that looks pretty good there. For our FS, this is where we're going to collect any records from PSA that have not been processed before. Put that in our transform connection. Now for our FA, in this case, we don't really have to aggregate. Once again, the source system has a primary key, which is a composite on sales order ID and sales order detail ID. But since we know that sales order detail ID is also a candidate key because it is an identity step 1.1, that there's really and that is going to be our degenerate in our fact table. We know that there will never be a case where we have more than one record with the same modified date with the same sales order detail ID. So once again, there's never going to be a case where there's more than one record with the same sales order detail ID and the same modified date. But what we do need to make sure we do here is only load into the fact table the latest version of each of these facts. We don't want to aggregate, for example, if we had multiple facts in our, or multiple versions of a record in our PSA because something has changed, the one that we want to place into our fact table is the latest version. And the way we're going to make that determination here is we're simply going to use our modified date once again. We're going to take this guy here and create another transform, and we'll put him over here, and we'll just call this the fact current sales order detail, and we'll just say get latest modified date for each record. So if there's more than one version of a sales order detail in this flow, then what this component is going to do is it's going to find out what the latest modified date is. And we're going to put this T1000, just a standard transformation component template. This will be in our transform connection definition. All right. So with that in place, what I can do now is just use that. I can join to that guy here. So here we have all of our unprocessed records, and they're all going through this, or they're all being used as a source to this component. and then we're going to join to this one such that when we get right here, we're only going to include all the records that are the latest version. So we're going to join here. We're going to do an inner join, which is going to exclude any of the versions of records that are not current. So we'll just say get current version of all records by inner joining to FC sales order detail. And once again, this is going to go in our transform. And that's good enough. So now we know that our fact source is at the right grain. It's going to be with the sales order detail ID as the most granular field. So we're ready to load our fact table. So the fact table will go in our DW connection. There's really nothing else to do here. We could add in here a list of foreign keys, but I'm not actually going to write all those out. One thing I am going to do is I'm going to say that we have a degenerate dimension, which is going to be on sales order detail ID. Now, we're also going to add a degenerate dimension here on sales order detail, or sales order ID, excuse me. And what that does is it gives us a field that we may not necessarily want to place that in the fact table. This is debatable, but basically what it's going to do is it's going to tell us or give us a way of determining which transaction or which sales transaction each of these details were a part of. We'll take a look at that more closely whenever we actually start building the components. All right, now to our FULS, or update load status. This is going to be pretty standard. We're going to change all records to being processed, and this is going to go in our PSA. Now, notice that we're setting all records to processed by sourcing that, or by determining that based on this FS. And this FS, this fact source, has all records, not only the most current version, but all records that were not processed. So you can derive from this that since we're only loading the current version of these records, and here we've selected all versions of records, potentially more than one, that there are some records that are being marked as processed that have never made it into the fact table, and that's exactly what we want to have happen, is our fact table should only contain the most current version of our fact. Okay. Now, the other thing I should mention here is that we're using modified date as a field that we have to depend on. This may not always be the case, of course, in source systems where you have a modified date that you can depend on being changed and handled in the way that you would expect. In other words, if a record is modified, the system generates a new modified date for that record. If you had cases where the modified date is not there, or if you have the potential for users to manipulate the modified date in a non-systematic manner, then you'd have to provision for those scenarios as well. All right, so now we have our fact sales order detail, so our lowest grain of sales here. We now need to be able to add to this some information from our header. Remember, our header is going to relate to our detail on the sales order ID, but we also need the header so that we can add in the information we need to be able to look up our foreign keys for a couple of our dimensions. Now, the sales order header, although it is part of our fact table, what we really need to know about that header is what is the current version of the header. That's pretty much what we need to know. And to get the current version of a header would be the same thing as saying, give me a dimension which is tracking attributes on an SCD1 basis. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add in a design pattern for a dimension. And this dimension is going to be loaded with our sales order header information. I'm going to take a break here and fill a lot of these things out so that we can just talk about them a little quicker. So I'll be back in just a second. Okay, so I went ahead and filled out this path right here. Quickly going to go over what I did. We sourced this from sales order header. We consolidated it into a sales order header PSA. Again, we're incrementally extracting using our modified date. Modified date is also our record time. Then we're coming in and getting our DS, which is our dimension source of unprocessed records. Have our DA. I'm going to go ahead and mark this as inactive because once again, our source system primary key is on sales order ID, and we have a dimension key on sales order ID. So, and I'm not doing anything else special here, so I know that I don't need to aggregate. I'm never going to have a case where for the same modified date, I have multiple versions of the same record based on sales order ID as a key. So then we load our dimensions with sales order header information, and we take care of our load status tracking. So that gets me what I need to know exactly what my current version of my sales order header information is. What I can do now is I can take that and I can use it here. Here. Try to get these lined back up real quick. There we go. All right, so now with that information, I can go ahead and look up my foreign keys for territory and for dates. I have several dates that I want to provide foreign keys for. Now the dates, we don't have to actually do the lookup. We're just going to use our key format of year, month, day. But in any case, we're going to create foreign keys based on attributes that are available here in our sales order header, not in our sales order detail. So we're going to join here, and we're going to provide the information as we're loading our fact. So that takes care of the case whenever I'm loading facts for the first time. I'm loading a line item or an order detail for the first time. But what if after that record was loaded, I have a change in my sales order header information? For some reason, somebody goes back in and they reclassify, for example, a territory. Or even more likely, what is going to happen is that the ship date won't be available until sometime after the sale actually occurred. So I'm going to be accumulating this information. I need to create an accumulated snapshot fact table. So there's nothing here that's going to tell me that information is changed. That's going to come from down here in the header. So I'm going to make a change to this data flow diagram, and then we'll come back and talk about how we're going to capture those changes that happen in the header. Okay, I have the diagram updated, so let's talk about how we're going to ensure that changes to the sales order header are reflected in our fact table. So remember, we have our sales order header dimension here. That's just basically being used to look up the business keys so we can actually get our foreign key lookups done for our sales fact table. Well, down here, what we're also doing is as we get our sales order header records that are unprocessed, we're taking them and bringing them into another path where we are first going to determine what the current version of those headers are. Very similar to what we did above in the sales order detail. We're getting the current version. We're saying what is the latest modified date for the sales order ID. And then we're doing an inner join to all of our records. So basically we're filtering out anything that is not the current version of a sales order ID. And we're using that to load into a fact table. Now this fact table has a degenerate dimension on sales order ID, and it also has foreign keys to our date and territory. But we're not actually going to create this fact table. We're redirecting it. We're going to point it toward our original fact table. So what that's going to do is it's going to update this fact table. It's going to update the foreign keys for our date and territory dimensions anytime that we have a change in our sales order header. So hopefully that makes sense. We're going to be using this to create our components here in upcoming courses. But let's quickly recap what we did in this entire course. First of all, we started out by picking up where we left off in our BD 110, or our data flow diagram course, where we created a very basic diagram, one fact table surrounded by four dimensions. Then we started taking a look at our source system, and we figured out how we were going to source our product dimension, where we basically sourced it from a product table as well as a couple of other tables, and we set up processes that are going to make sure that our product dimension is always reflecting the current version of all attributes. Then we created our promotion and our location data flow diagrams, where they were very simple. We just basically sourced them from one table. We loaded that data into our dimension. Then for our date, it was even simpler. All we needed to do there is actually generate a date dimension and use that generated table as our dimension source. So we'll be using our existing dimension template for this. Then in our fact, which we just completed, we have a two source table scenario here, where our sales order detail is going to be used to create our primary fact table. It's going to set the grain, and then we're going to augment that with some attributes, or for some business keys from our sales order header that are going to be used to do our foreign key lookups to date and territory. We then added a second path here for sales order header to make sure that any changes in our header which come in asynchronous to our sales order detail, our line items, to make sure that those values are actually updated in our sales fact table as well. So now we have our data flow diagram, which is going to support all of the dimensions that we require, as well as our fact table. We obviously have a dimensional model as well in place, so we're ready to start building components. Thank you for listening through this course, and we'll see you in the next course.